Hi, I'm Congresswoman Jo Ann Emerson of Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and today I have the privilege of having a wonderful World War II veteran, Kenneth Eugene Bender, tell us his story. Mr. Bender was born on September 7th, 1925, here in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. And he served during World War II in the Army Air Force. He reached the highest rank of tech sergeant. He was a gunner, and I know you'll hear the story. And then after the war, he was in the Air Force Reserves and commissioned as a first lieutenant. This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, and it is being done at Southeast Missouri University here in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. So, thank you so much for doing this.
Glad to be here.
Really, really, really appreciate it. And I think the first thing, it would be helpful for the folks who will be watching this video is tell us a little bit about yourself, where you were born, and just growing up, your family, and then what prompted you to join the Army Air Force for World War II.
Well, I was born here in Cape, and I grew up during the Depression. And when the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, I was a 13-year-old paper boy that I was called out at 6 o'clock in the morning to deliver an extra that the Southeast Missourian printed to tell of the beginning of the war, which eventually became World War II. During the Depression years, I was just such a kid that I didn't realize how poor we were, but and most of my friends were too. But I grew up in a very loving family and have great memories of those years.
Do you have brothers, sisters?
I have two sisters and a brother. My brother, I was the baby of the family. My brother was a B-17 pilot flying out of England, and he went down over occupied France and was captured and was a prisoner of war until Germany surrendered. And that was taking place while I was in training before I went overseas. So the two of us were both in the Air Force.
And so both of you then were gone, so I imagine the family was quite concerned.
Yes. My mother, of course, I think wrote to each one of us every day. And when you have mail call in the Army, you want a letter. Rather have one from a girlfriend, but any letter is wonderful.
Mm-hmm. So tell me then, why did you decide the Army Air Force?
Well, my older brother was a pilot, and I thought that would just be outstanding. By the time I went into the service, they already had enough pilots, I think, and so I didn't have a chance to go to pilot training, but instead I went to what I thought of as a very interesting unit, which was Central Fire Control. The B-29 was the first plane during World War II where the guns were fired by remote control.
Oh, really?
All the others, B-17s, B-24s, all of them, the gunner was actually in the turret with his guns, and he moved as the guns moved.
So how did it work then with the remote control?
Well, I sat in a blister on top of the plane and had a gun sight, which I moved following the target. It went through a rather primitive computer and made all kinds of corrections for the speed we were flying, the speed of the attacking plane, and things of this sort, and relayed that information to the motors that drove the gun turret and fired the guns. And it was a fascinating system. I spent about 6 months at a school at Lowry Field in Denver, Colorado, learning the system. And there was one fire control gunner on each B-29, and that was my job.
Wow. Now, how many of you all can, how many people could be held on the B-29?
Normally it was a crew of 10, but we could have held quite a few more. A lot of times on reconnaissance missions there would be a weather observer and a photographer, and we'd be 12 then.
That's interesting. So you could say that you were one of the first people here in the United States who used, a computer type of system for in the military.
Yes, I think so. It was. It did a fantastic job. It made all sort of corrections. I had a upper forward turret which had 4 50 caliber machine guns in it, and I was about 40 feet away from that, and the computer made the necessary corrections as a fighter came toward us.
It's just amazing.
For that difference between where the sight was and where the guns were.
I can't imagine that people would realize that was probably when we started utilizing the computers. So now tell me a little bit. So where did you did your training there in Denver, Colorado. Where were you actually posted then?
I went from Denver to Clovis, New Mexico, which was an air base, and was assigned to a crew there. None of us had ever seen any of the others before, and we met and were trained there as a crew. Mm-hmm. They didn't have enough B-29s yet at that time. They hadn't been produced very long, and part of our training was done on a B-17. And then towards the end of our training, there were more B-29s available, and we flew on B-29s and became proficient in the systems on the B-29. I was at Clovis from about August of 1944 to February of 1945 in this training, and then in early March of 45 we went to Guam. When we got our orders to go overseas, we were given $1 million B-29 just out of the factory.
Wow.
And we flew it all the way to the Pacific island of Guam, which was to be our home for the rest of the war. And when we got to Guam, we were given a few days to settle in, and during this time, one of the older crews, whose plane was grounded for repairs, was assigned to fly our new plane on a mission to Tokyo. And they were shot down and crashed in Tokyo Bay.
With your brand new plane?
Yes. And suddenly the war seemed very close. And a few days later, we were assigned to our first mission. And we were all prepared, and we were based at Northfield on Guam, and there were 2 parallel runways there, each 2 miles long, and a narrow strip, maybe a quarter of a mile wide, of land between the end of the runway and the edge of the island. And at the edge of the island was a 500-foot cliff that dropped down to the ocean. And we were flying a borrowed plane that was on its 13th mission because ours had been shot down. And all the plane, because we were new, I guess, we had to be the last to take off. They called it tail end Charlie. And we watched as the planes ahead of us worked their way to the head of the taxi strip, crossed over to the runway, and began their takeoff roll. And they were all heavily loaded with bombs and gasoline. It was about a 15-hour round trip, about 3,000 miles in the air over ocean. And they were heavily loaded, and we watched as they ran down the runway, and they seemed to barely get their wheels off the ground by the time they got to the end of the runway. Then they'd disappear over the cliff, and we could see them then come up in the distance as they began to climb. And while we were watching this, all of a sudden, there was a terrific explosion below the cliff, and the night lit up as bright as noon. And one of the planes had lost its fight to stay in the air. And other planes were already racing down the runway. They started one on each runway at 1 minute intervals. And so every 30 seconds, one was going over the cliff, and they just kept right on going. And of course, tension was mounted in and for us when this happened. But we kept moving on slowly forward to our turn to take off. And while we were doing this, all of a sudden our number 3 engine caught on fire. The B-29 has a built-in fire extinguisher on each engine, and just in a matter of seconds our flight engineer had put the fire out. The pilot had shut down the engine, feathered the propeller, and we were sure that we'd be instructed to go back to our parking area and abort the mission. Instead, the control tower radioed to restart the engine and continue on the mission.
How did you feel?
That tension mounted a little more. And we were the last to go over the cliff that night, but we came back safely the next day. And many missions later, a lone B-29 by the name of Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second B-29 named Boxcar dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki. And we felt really honored to be chosen to do the photography of Nagasaki as it burned. We flew there, back and forth over the city, taking what I think of as maybe hundreds of pictures of the roaring inferno below us, just being devastated. And we spent several hours there before coming back to Guam.
So you were actually on your air base there in Guam as those atomic bombs were being deployed.
Yes.
And then, how long was it again after the bombs were dropped at Nagasaki and?
Well, Hiroshima was on August 6th and Nagasaki August the 9th.
So how long after that did you go to take those photographs?
We flew up there. The bomb was dropped on Nagasaki about noon, I think, maybe 11 o'clock in the morning.
Did you all know about this was going to happen?
No, we didn't. But when we got the assignment to fly to Nagasaki, all of a sudden there were some high brass who showed up to fly with us. And then we were told. And we had the deputy wing commander from the 314th Wing who flew with us. And we knew where we were going by that time. We were flying all by ourselves, and the other 2 planes that had flown separately had dropped a bomb, and we didn't know if the Japanese would think that we carried a third one or not, but of course we didn't. And we took off. I think the bomb was dropped at about 11 in the morning. We took off about 5 or 6 that evening, and we're over Nagasaki about 7 hours later, which probably would make it in the middle of the night, but we stayed on station until daylight and took daylight pictures. And
now you were just in the air the whole time. You didn't land, did you?
No, in the air, yes.
Yeah.
We carried extra fuel tanks in our bomb bays so that we could stay in the air that long.
Goodness gracious. How did, what kind of emotions went through you just looking at the devastation?
Well, I was just a 19-year-old kid, and I just thought it was wonderful. You know, I thought this is going to end the war maybe before we get shot down or something, and before anybody else has to invade more islands. And I was excited about it.
So then what, so after you performed that mission of going and doing the photography and having the top brass, if you will, fly with y'all, tell me about what other types of things, when you got back to Guam, there was still a lot of fighting left to do.
Well, not really. After the second bomb was dropped, I think possibly peace negotiations were beginning, and we were ordered not to bomb anymore. However, we had been trained as a reconnaissance crew, and we kept flying, doing reconnaissance work. And then a few days after the bomb was dropped, we got instructions to load our bomb bays with crates of food, medical supplies, and beer. Fly to try and locate a camp near Osaka, Japan, that was a prisoner of war camp where American prisoners were being held, and drop the supplies to them. We flew up there, and we didn't have very good directions as to where the camp might be, and we flew around Osaka area for quite some time, up one valley and down the next, and most of them had clouds in them, and we kept going lower and lower so that we could get under the clouds. All at once we came out of the clouds, and right there underneath us was the camp we were looking for. Oh my goodness. But we were so low that we almost hit the power line running into the camp. And we swerved away from that, and we're headed right towards the side of a mountain. And we turned and flew into the valley, and flew a short distance till we could climb to about 500 feet, and then we circled back. We could see the fellows on the ground waving their arms and running around. We dropped the supplies and watched as the parachutes fluttered to the ground, and they were running around wildly, breaking open the crates. We didn't see any guards. We could see the people playing. You know, 500 feet is not even 2 city blocks. Right. And the gates were wide open, and we didn't see any guards, and they seemed to be in the prisoners doing what they wanted, and they were just ecstatic, and this really gave us the best feeling of anything we did during the war.
I can imagine. So do you know how soon after you dropped those supplies that those prisoners were actually, or our soldiers were out of there?
Yes, I've gotten this mostly, I guess, from newspaper articles after the war, but I think if I remember right, we dropped that on August the 13th. And the Japanese formally surrendered on September the 2nd. And I don't think any Americans were allowed on Japanese soil until after the surrender. And when September 2nd came, we joined an armada of 1,000 B-29s and 1,000 Navy carrier planes to fly over the battleship Missouri, on which the surrender took place, at the time of the surrender. And it was called a show of force. And we flew just out of sight of the battleship. The Tokyo Bay was just full of Allied warships, destroyers, aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, everything had surrounded the battleship Missouri for this ceremony. And most of this, I guess, I read after the war, that Admiral Halsey was on the deck with General MacArthur, and that after the Japanese had signed, General MacArthur said, "Let them go, Bull." and Admiral Halsey then gave a signal which was radioed back to the planes circling, and we started our flyover. And if you can imagine 2,000 airplanes, and we flew low enough, I think about 400 feet above the decks of the Missouri, and we could see the people on the deck, and a long trail of all these planes. We flew on across Tokyo Bay and over Tokyo. I had been over Tokyo at 30,000 feet several times before, but here at 400 feet I could see what our firebombing had done. It was just burned out. And there was kind of away from the rest of it, there was a green area, and there sat the Emperor's Palace. And we circled next to Mount Fujiyama and returned towards Guam, and World War II was over.
Goodness. And so how long did you stay on Guam after that?
I was there till right before Thanksgiving, sometime in November. I actually was in the States on Thanksgiving, but not home yet. But I was home in time for Christmas.
Well, I know your family was thrilled.
Oh my, yes. And by that time, my brother was home too.
I was going to ask if he had gotten home as well.
Yes.
So tell us what types of medals and honors you got while serving.
Well, our highest award was the Distinguished Flying Cross. You know, when if a soldier on the ground jumps out of a foxhole and does something, he's committed an act of valor. But on an airplane, all of you are in it together.
Right.
And so when a medal is awarded, it's awarded to each person that was there. And we were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for a mission that we flew over Gifu, Japan in July. And 3 different times we were awarded the Air Medal for other little smaller missions. We were awarded 2 Bronze Stars. Our whole bomb group, the 330th Bombardment Group, was awarded 2 presidential citations. Each of us in the bomb group at the time received
what were the president specifically? What were those presidential citations?
The presidential citations were simply for the totality of the work that had been done by that bomb group.
That's a lot of salad on your uniform.
Well, it looked good.
I bet it did.
I didn't wear it long though. The war was over.
So then you came home and tell us what how you settled in. I know that you were commissioned as a first lieutenant in the Air Force Reserves, but just share a little bit about what it was like when you got home.
Well, I had done 1 year of work here at SEMO, just out of high school, before I went into the service. And when I came back, came back to SEMO on the GI Bill and finished my degree, graduated in 1948 with a degree in business administration. And I really was just a sort of a kid again, I guess. I read about soldiers coming home from Afghanistan with post-traumatic syndromes and so forth, and I didn't have any of that. I came back to college and dated the girls and ran around with my buddies and drank beer and did all the usual things, and I got married in 1950. I spent almost 50 years as an oil jobber. I was a wholesaler for Texaco and delivered gas, and I had 5 convenience stores of my own that tied in with that. And I didn't retire till 1997. I was getting close to 70 years old by that time.
Well, working keeps you young sometimes. So.
Well, I guess just having fun.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think, there are always these questions about, post-traumatic stress syndrome and the like. but so many more of you, of your generation, served in the military. I mean, it was all hands on deck, and it's a lot different than it is today. So I would say, what, did most of your buddies all serve in one branch or the other?
Yes, just all the guys back at school in 1945, 6, 7, and 8 were about like I was, and they had all been either in the Navy or the Army or the Air Corps or something, and I had some friends who had been in the Marines, and we all still wore the Army khaki pants to class at school and things of that sort.
So let's see, how old were you when you got back?
I was 20. The Japanese surrendered on September the 2nd, and I turned 20 on September the 7th, 5 days later.
Isn't that a remarkable experience that you had at such a young age?
Yes, it was. And I didn't realize it was my birthday till late in the afternoon that day, because our plane had a new engine put on, and we were going to take it up in the air and what they called slow time, sort of break it in.
Mm-hmm.
And while we were getting ready, we were pre-flighting the plane, and I was up on top of the plane. A B-29 was coming into land, and we were not more than a block away from the runway, I guess. And somebody in a weapons carrier, which is a vehicle just a little larger than a Jeep, crossed the runway in front of this landing plane, and it scared the pilot, and he tried to take off again, and in his attempt, he crashed. And we thought for a few seconds he was going to plow into us, but he didn't. The plane broke in half. They were all killed. And we were ordered to get in the air as quick as we could and know that we could fly without crashing. And we flew for hours just around in circles around the island. And we came back, and I was on my bunk in the Quonset hut writing a letter, and I wrote the date September 7th at the top of the letter.
Wow.
And I said, hey, this is my birthday.
So you did an awful lot in that short time that you served.
Yes.
But those memories and the experiences, I know, last forever. So all of your buddies who served, you all were friends. Now tell me about, do you still, those who are still alive, do you all still stay together? Do you belong to veterans organizations?
This is interesting, because for the first few years after the war, we exchanged Christmas cards or something like that, an occasional letter. And then that all fell by the wayside, and I never heard from any of the guys for years. And about a year ago, there's a lady near Chicago whose father was in the same bomb group I was in, and she puts out a quarterly newsletter about people who were served with her dad. And I saw this on a website on the computer, and she asked anybody who had any stories to tell, contact her. So I emailed her, and she emailed back and asked me if I would write something about the crew I was on. I hadn't known her dad. We were not close in that area. But I wrote a little article, and she published it. And I got a number of long-distance phone calls from that. And one of them was from the 93-year-old man who had been the co-pilot on the crew that I was on. And he's in a nursing home in North Carolina. And we chatted for a long time, I bet an hour. And it's the only time that I've heard from any of them, probably in nearly 70 years. And we've corresponded a time or two since then. And this lady who maintains this website has gone through, I sent her a list of the fellows that were on our crew, and she has searched exhaustively on the computer and so forth. And I think maybe he and I are the only two left alive. A couple of the references said one of them said, try St. Peter's Cemetery, and things of this sort. And so I've kind of dropped that.
But isn't that extraordinary, though, that you all could connect just
Yes.
within the last year?
Yeah.
So tell me, what kind of life lessons did the experience serving our country at such a critical time? What kind of life lessons did you learn from that?
Well, I've always been very proud of my service, and very proud of the country. And I don't know that there were any real life lessons. Just do your duty and do what you're expected to do. That's about it.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
That's about the end of the story, I think.
Ken, thank you so much for sharing. I think the American public will love hearing this story, and it's just so important that we be able to record all of your stories and those of your fellow veterans, because it's the best way for us to learn a little bit more about what happened in the wars. It's certainly a lot more interesting, and you just learn better what goes inside your heads while you're going through these experiences, and you certainly can't learn any of that in a textbook.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me to really kind of get back into this and repeat some of the old stories. My kids were after me for years to write them down, and I've done a little of that now. But for so many years, I didn't do any of it.
Why is it that heroes always are very humble?
Well, I wasn't a hero. I just did what thousands of other fellows did at the same time.
Well, we thank you so much. Thank you for your service, and thanks for sharing today.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.